Hello folks, this is Tom from anti-proton.com, and this is my buyer's guide to Geiger counters. It's not exactly a buying guide per se. I'm not really going to go into too many different units and models and which ones to buy, because I'm not really trying to sell them or anything. I don't sell Geiger counters. But I want to kind of give you an idea of what to get, since I constantly get emails from people asking me what's the best to get for a certain amount of money, what kind of features do I need. So let me try to go into this, and I'm not going to go into too much about the physics and explanation of the science, because that isn't the purpose of this video. I have plenty of other videos that explain what an alpha particle is, what a gamma ray, what a beta particle is. This is a Geiger counter tube. This is the actual tube itself. It has a voltage that runs down the center. There's a center wire, a high voltage, and that high voltage, if it touches the outside of this material, will send a pulse back to the detector registering a count. When I put something radioactive near it, the high energy ionizing radiation that flies out of this little source right here will fly through this tube, and it will ionize the air inside, causing electrical charge to jump across and registering a pulse. So to put that in 10-second layman's terms, this thing, whenever it gets near anything radioactive, generates a pulse, a tick if you hear that little ticking sound or the flash of light, every time it detects a particle that is emitted, a high energy particle that is emitted. The radiation that we're talking about is ionizing radiation. It comes from atoms. We're not talking about electromagnetic radiation. We're not talking about ultraviolet. We're not talking about cell phone radiation. You often hear people talking about cell phones. They say, oh, does that detect cell phones? No, it has nothing to do with cell phones. Nothing to do with microwaves. Nuclear radiation. You see that symbol, the trifoil? That's what we're referring to. In this case, it's cobalt-60. So, let's get into first off what one does with a Geiger counter. In other words, why should you buy one? They are useful for geology. Are your samples radioactive? You can even prospect for uranium with one of these things. They are useful for fun and science, and the explanation to, for example, a classroom of how nuclear radiation works, with a very simple weak sample that isn't particularly dangerous in a Geiger counter. Great hands-on tool, also useful for hobbyists. They're useful after a nuclear accident. Are your shoes radioactive? Is there radiation on your street corner? Is it raining down on you? Do you live close to a nuclear power plant? Hopefully this would never come up, but if it did, it'd be nice to have a Geiger counter. They're kind of a must right now if you go to northern Japan. Accidents like that also extend to things like thermonuclear war. Although by the time you've gotten into thermonuclear war, I'm not really sure how useful a Geiger is going to be, since these days we'd probably already be just cinder cones with all the accurate stuff they have. But it's nice to have something for that purpose. The CDV-700 here was actually designed for civilian use following a nuclear war, believe it or not. And then of course there's also the bad guys. These days we have crazy people everywhere. And you also have professional use. Sometimes you need these sorts of devices for professional use. This is actually a scintillation counter, but they have Geiger counters that look very similar to this. And this is much more of a professional unit right here. So there are many different reasons to own one. I wouldn't own one just for pure paranoia's sake. That's something I do see a lot of, people wanting to buy these because they're afraid that they are out to get them, that kind of thing. I would only buy one of these more for something like geology or scientific interest, and maybe have a secondary interest in being prepared, if you like. I wouldn't buy one just for being prepared, because you're going to spend a lot of time constantly keeping a thing in good running condition and calibrated. But anyhow, let's get into the very features now, the things that you want on a Geiger counter, because you see so many of them out there. What do they have? What things to look for? Let's go into a couple of them. So now that I've said that you can't tell the difference between two nuclear materials, for example, one of these is cobalt-60, one of these is cesium-137, using a Geiger counter, which means you wouldn't be able to do food testing, for example, because you wouldn't know if it was naturally occurring radioactivity in the food or if it was actually something from, like, you know, Chernobyl fallout or something. So the question is, what would you use? By the way, this is not related to Geiger counters, but I just want to answer this question because it's a common question that comes up. Use something like this, a gamma spectrometer. A bit more expensive, a bit more complicated, and a bit more sensitive. So let's zero this out and quickly figure out which one of these is cobalt 60, which one of these is cesium-137. Slap that in the detector and see what we get. And very, very quickly you see these two peaks forming here at 1175 and 1332 keV. These tell you right off the bat that this is cobalt 60. So now we know it's cobalt 60. Alright, so we now know what this is because we can see the energies with this type of detector as opposed to just the specific counts. Let's get rid of that, put the second one in. What do we get? We get a peak right here at 662 keV, classic cesium-137. So this is cesium-137, this is cobalt 60. And they say so on the little chips. But the problem, of course, with the Geiger counter is it does exactly the same thing with both of them, except this one's a little bit weaker, so it does a little bit less. But otherwise, it's doing the same thing. It's just making little ticks. So just a side note, something to look into. And by the way, don't look into one of these things unless you're looking at least $1,500 or more. Just throwing that out there. All right, to alpha or not to alpha. Some detectors can detect alpha radiation. For example, this pancake probe. See this wide probe? Has a metal screen over top of a really thin membrane detector that's super thin. Alpha particles can't go through very much. Even a sheet of paper will block them. But they can make it through this little tiny thin screen and then through the thin membrane to be detected. Something like this depression glass puts off a huge percentage of its radiation in the form of alpha. The rest of it comes out as beta and gamma. So when you put the detector backwards over top of this, you're going to pick up a little tiny bit of the gamma rays that are coming through it. They're going right through the back end of the detector right here, and they're hitting the detector from the back side. But when you flip it over, you're picking up mostly alphas, and you're getting lots of them. When you put the detector over the front, you don't get as many. You're not getting quite as many. If you actually average this out, it comes out a little bit less. So when you take a detector like this guy right here, this is for an old CDV 700 that I attached to this Ludlam. This guy right here has a nickel-plated shield on it that allows you to only detect gamma. And you get basically almost nothing off of this plate. Just a couple counts every now and then. Right? You can open up the shield. Now we can detect beta. Maybe a little tiny bit more comes through because you're getting a little bit of beta. But you're never going to get any alpha from this thing. And so this item barely registers as radioactive. Barely. Whereas, with the alpha detector, it's obviously radioactive. Now, when you hear pancake probe, this is what they're referring to. It's this little tiny membrane here with the metal over the top of it. Some detectors have this built into the bottom of them, like right here, and they don't have this external probe. Some detectors even have a thin window detector, which is this little guy right here, a very small probe that has a little tiny nub on the end that's opened up with the mesh window allowing alphas to get through. This type of detector is also able to detect alphas, albeit not very many. One of the reasons this isn't detecting many is because very little surface area of this is being exposed to this. This is a problem with smaller probes. So, the purpose behind an alpha detector is to be able to detect alpha radiation. Kind of goes without saying, I guess, but I said it anyway. Also, really, really low energy betas, like what comes from tritium, for example, and really, really, really weak X-rays can be detected with one of these detectors. So the benefit is you can do things like, for example, surface monitoring to look to see if there's surface contamination on an object, like alpha surface contamination. The downside to it, though, is you have this fragile window. If we were to take these two detectors on an airplane, I've done that actually with both, this one has a higher survivability due to pressure changes than this one does. The tube on this can blow out. Now, you hear that warning all the time, don't take these type of detectors in airplanes. I've taken this one in dozens of airplanes and never had a problem, but it can blow out. And your airplane doesn't have to like lose pressure for that to happen. If it totally lost pressure, it might blow out this one too. But just slight pressure changes can blow these tubes out. That includes going up to the top of a mountain too. So be careful with these things. The downside is that they cost more and they're more fragile. The upside to them is you can detect an entire new form of radiation that you cannot detect with these other types of detectors. So keep that in mind. By the way, this unit right here, just so I don't make it sound bad, can have a detector attached to it like this that you pull off and then use. So it can also detect alpha if it has the right detector connected to it. So the big difference between alpha and not alpha is the ability to detect alpha. The reason you detect alpha is because alpha contamination when it's inside of your body is extremely dangerous. It is worse than gamma, it is worse than beta when it is inside of your body. Outside it can't even penetrate your skin, but inside it can penetrate a lot more than your skin. So it's considered to be 20 times more deadly, and I'll put links to that in there because I just had a large conversation with somebody about this exact same topic just a few days ago. So before I get back into that again. Alright, and let me just, while I'm here, let me also point out the concept that it is the size that counts, not just how you use it. Having a big detector like this is going to give me 50-60 counts per minute as a background. Having a little tiny detector like this detector is about the size of a AA battery, gives me a much smaller background. Do you see what I mean? Now, that means a tiny change in this, a change of 1 or 2 counts per minute, is more significant than a change in this guy right here, which would be 8 or 9 counts per minute for the same change. But that also means that statistical accuracy changes are slightly more relevant, and because we're reading counts per minute, the difference between each count becomes more important. As a result of it, this is apparently less accurate. The reality is they have exactly the same accuracy, but because the digital display has a limited number of values it can show you, it's kind of like having less notches on the dial when you're moving back and forth, if that makes any sense. So if I were to hunt for something that was radioactive, I would want something with a higher count rate because I can more easily from my eye see the fluctuation between them. They're actually showing the same level of error between them, the same level of fluctuation. It's just easier for a human being to see it, if that makes any sense. And then you can get into really big detectors later on, like this baby right here. That guy right there, it gets a background of 1,800 to 2,000 counts per minute. So always go, if you can, with a bigger detector. Size matters. If you can sometimes find little tiny ones that are cheap. This guy, for example, right here has a scintillation counter in it, but in the back it has a tiny itty bitty little Geiger counter that it uses for emergency backup purposes. But by itself it wouldn't be useful at all. In this unit, because it has a scintillation counter built into it, it's perfectly fine, but by itself it wouldn't be. So look for the size of the tube. The tube in here is about that long. This tube gets about 20-30 counts per minute, which is better than this tube, which is smaller. But this tube is probably better than this tube because this tube has the ability to sense alpha. Does that kind of make sense the way that's going? So it's size and the ability to detect alpha. Alright, so let's get into a couple other features. First off, jamming and saturation. Let's say that there was a nuclear disaster in your hometown, okay? And the nuclear plant melted down in the middle of the night and you and your family want to go in and get in the car and you want to get away. Well, let's say you're driving down the road and you come up to an area and you're not sure if you should drive there or not, so you hold the detector out the window and it's just suddenly exposed to a tremendously large amount of radiation. I'm talking about a lot of radiation, not the levels we're dealing with here in my little dinky lab. I'm talking 1,000 times that. How will these two detectors respond? Well, this guy right here is an old detector built in ancient days of yore. It will fly all the way to the max reading and then it will slowly drift back down and stop. And you're going to think, oh, well, I must have hit an energy spike, but now everything's fine. It's just become overloaded. There's so much radiation that the tube is now conducting a continuous electrical circuit through it. Basically, it's not making ticks anymore. The ticks have just become a solid meet. So as a result of that, this detector looks like it's showing you nothing because it is jammed, it is saturated. As a result, you could be exposed to radiation, a lot of it, and have no idea that's happening. Now, this isn't going to happen unless you're like walking through downtown Chernobyl, okay? I mean, like, well, Pripyat. But my point is, you'd have to be like by Fukushima. So this is not something that normally comes up. But if a truck carrying, for example, cesium-137 samples, crashed and there was a local nuclear disaster, if you like, scenarios like that can happen. So keep that in mind. That most modern day units like this guy, for example, have anti-jamming. Oh, it can't read after a certain point. If this gets too high, it cannot read, the same as this one. The difference is this will recognize that it's hit that high level, and it will say something on the screen. They all act differently. Sometimes they say jam, sometimes they say high, sometimes they show the max reading and they beep at you and stuff. So they have different ways of showing it, and you should look through your user manual to see what the unit's supposed to do. But my point is this guy will say, look, boss, I can't read this anymore. This is like a psychotic amount of radiation, but I'm at least going to tell you that that's the reason that I'm not able to read anything. It's not because it's not there, it's because I am like completely saturated. This guy, you've seen it on videos before, it says OL for overload. So I mean, this happens when I went by somebody with a nuclear nuclear stress test radio tracer inside of them when it overload. So keep that in mind. That's an important thing to know if you're worried about survival stuff. If you're just testing around the lab, it's not as important, but you should probably keep it memorized anyway. Next up is alert levels. A device like this cannot give you an alert. So if you had this sitting beside you and you were driving through, let's say you're driving through a place that was radioactive. You decided to go to northern Japan, for example, and you're driving around. If you go over a hotspot, this one right here, if you go fast enough, you're not going to know because it's going to tick for a few seconds, but your car's already gone over it. Right? It isn't caught up to it, if you like. Devices like this, you can give them, you can set alert levels. And when you set the alert level on this thing, we set this to, let's see, 320 counts per minute is fine. Okay. So now we're set to 320 counts per minute. If this thing hits 320 counts per minute, it will alarm. Let's see what happens. It's annoying. Shut up. It's supposed to be annoying. And it's going to keep alerting. Okay, cut it off. It's annoying. It's going to keep alerting until such time that you're out of that field or until you get annoyed and shut it off. Now, that's annoying, yes, but there's a benefit behind it. Sometimes it's nice to have something like this. There are various scenarios where you'd want to be alarmed. You could have one of these inspector model that doesn't have a, this isn't an inspector, but it looks just like one, that doesn't have the cable coming off of it. You can have this sitting beside you like I do. On the way to work every single day, I have an inspector. It's not this unit or this unit. It's a different one I'm not showing in the video. And I have it set to an alert level of 120 counts per minute. As I'm driving down the highway, if I drive past a truck or something that's emitting, radiation, it goes off and I know it, which is sort of interesting, kind of neat and fun. So the next thing on the list, by the way, that beep was to tell you that it hit statistical accuracy. That's what that little beep was for. The next thing on the list is the ability to detect and to identify the activity of radionuclides. So neither of these two detectors have this capability. This one does, but it's not actually a Geiger counter. My other one does, but I don't have it in this video right this moment. And what you do in that kind of scenario is you tell the Geiger counter, I am specifically looking at cobalt-60. And then you put a cobalt-60 sample down in a very specific configuration, put the detector over it, and it will tell you exactly what the activity is. Now, neither of these two, in fact, almost no units that I know of can do this. The Inspector USB from SE International can do it, and I think there's some other ones that can do it. Only detectors that are specifically designed to have that capability can do that. So it's something to kind of keep in mind. That's mostly a laboratory condition thing, because even out in the real world, you wouldn't want to run that. It wouldn't be very accurate. You have to have very specific amounts of the material and very specific little carrier devices that hook onto it so you can read it and everything like that. But something to keep in mind that exists. Alright, so let's talk about some extra additional considerations. These are extra things, not the major components of what you're deciding to buy. This is like the extra stuff. First off, the external detector versus internal. They are usually exactly the same kinds of units. The difference between them is simply that the probe is outside and connected with a wire as opposed to inside. So you're not getting more or less out of one. What you're getting is some additional abilities. With the external one, you can hold out your hand like this and test a source at a distance. You can throw this out towards a distance and stand back. You can, in the laboratory, it's nice to be able to move this around without having to touch the unit. But you sacrifice the portability you get with a device like this that you can toss in your pocket. If this is actually a CRM100, but if this were an Inspector USB, it would be exactly the same size as this unit, and it would have exactly the same detector, but be in the palm of your hand. So there's a lot of benefit to holding them like this. And I would tell you, if you're everybody when they want to get a Geiger counter always seems to want to get the external type. And I always talk to them about a year or two later and they always say, I wish I got the internal type. Think about it first. It's all just a matter of portability, which one you can carry around with you, because external detectors also can look squirrely, like this guy. What's that look like to you? If you were at an airport and this fell out of your bag, what do you think that might look like? Yeah. Now, luckily, I've had that fall out on my bag, and nothing bad happened because the TSA guys knew what it was. All right, I showed them all the paperwork and everything, and I'm all clear to go and all that kind of stuff. But the point is it's sometimes nice just to have an internal detector. Number 2 in the list, battery. A rechargeable battery versus a replaceable battery. All of my units are all of my units are replaceable batteries. So this guy right here, you can unscrew it, pull the battery out. These guys here, you can pull the battery out of the bottom. The Ludlam, you pull oops, pop this open, batteries come out, they're just Ds. This one even has a nice external, little external thing, so if one of the batteries melts down Chernobyl style, it doesn't take like the whole Ludlam with it. So the benefit to that is if you're in the field and your battery runs down and dies, you can just put a new battery in it. Now, and that's not to knock the rechargeables. Most of them have multiple years of rechargeability out of them. For example, what is it, Gamma Scout? Doesn't that have, I think it has like about a year or something like that of a charge off of its battery. NPRM 9000s and such like that, they have a long battery recharge time, and they're very easy to recharge. But in a disaster, I like to know that if there was an emergency, I can just rip a 9-volt out of this and put another one in. And I don't have to recharge it, because sometimes that doesn't work for you. So I'm not a fan of rechargeables, but I don't think that they're necessarily bad or that you should avoid one because it's rechargeable. I'm just not a fan of them. I personally think they have their place, and you can argue that then you don't have to have 9 volts sitting around all over the place and that sort of thing. Moving right along, calibration. Most of these units here need to be sent back to the manufacturer to calibrate. You can calibrate yourself if you have a powerful enough check source, but you can't just do it with a simple check source like the ones I have sitting around here. You need a cesium-137 check source of at least 370 kilobecquerels, that's 10 microcuries or more, and there are instructions in the actual packages that tell you how to do calibration. I don't do my own calibration. I don't even like to do it. So what I do is I send them off to the manufacturer to be calibrated. Older units like the CDV700 come with extensive manuals like this, which explain exactly how to calibrate the unit and everything about it, which is really cool. Older units have a tendency to even come with operational check sources. That's something you don't see in modern day units, and I really think you should. They also come with a really hard to remove probe. Good God. Operational check source, built right in the side here. It's actually a piece of nuclear material. If you put the detector up against it, and it reads, let's get this set right, reads around 2.5 milliroentgen per hour at the top, which is where it should in just a minute if I get this over it right. You'll know it's calibrated right. So anywhere from 2 to 2.5. And it can take up to 30 seconds to get there, so I need to go back and double check the calibration on this one. That can be useful. Something like my Ludlam, by the way, I took the handle off of this, I took the detector off of this. You can pull this whole damn thing apart, it's really nice. This one has a functional cesium-137 check source on the side. The benefit to this is that if you take your detector and put it up against the check source and you know exactly what the reading should be, that is the reading above your background, then if you're out in the middle of a field and you're exposed to some kind of high radiation reading and you want to know if it's right or wrong, you can always just put the detector against this and find out immediately if it's reading the same amount. That will tell you that it is probably functioning correctly. So there's a lot of benefit to having a check source. Very few units have this. Do not go hunting for them, you will not find them. Old CDV700s have them, modern day professional units like a Ludlam have them, but these little guys right here, as nice as they are, they don't usually come with them. But they're also pretty good to keep their calibration for a couple of years. Upgrades, devices, like for example, the Ludlam can be upgraded with many different types of detectors, many different types of devices. Things can be hooked up to this to do all kinds of stuff. For example, the check source is actually a upgrade hooked onto it. You can upgrade things like, for example, the CDV700. I had this upgraded so that I can remove the probe and hook up a different type of probe if I wanted to. You cannot upgrade most of the digital ones very easily, just simply because that's not how they're designed. They're a digital circuit board. You'd have to pull most of the circuit board apart to do that. You can buy them little rubber housings, for example, that you can fit them inside of it. And I would recommend this if you get this type, by the way, too. See, for the ones that have the internal detector that's in the back, you can open it up. This is great because then you can drop it and it's not as easily damaged. And I'd also like to point out the difference between metal and plastic. See, I don't even want to hit this one as hard. This is a good detector. It has been all over the world with me. But when it boils down to it, this thing, I've seen them on TV and YouTube, can roll down the side of a mountain and keep working. Yeah, I prefer, something fell over there, I prefer metal over plastic any day. That is not to knock plastic. It's just, who cares about that argument? Everyone knows metal is stronger than plastic. The next thing on the list are display types. There are digital and analog. Digital display types have the advantage of being very easy to read. Even a child can read this number. So what does it say? 58 counts per minute, 55 counts per minute. As you put a nuclear source near it, the number goes up. The downside to it, though, is you have to wait a little while before you'll see the averaged figure jump up. So we're at 500 counts per minute, 900 counts per minute, then all of a sudden, 1400, 10,000, 13,000. So it takes a little while to build up because it's using an average number. And you don't quite get the same response time. You notice I'm moving this back and forth and it's not keeping up with me, not in real time. Give it a few seconds, it will. So what you're doing is you're kind of sacrificing that real-time, instantaneous sort of reading in exchange for a much more easy to understand and accurate reading you can quickly look at. Also, typically these sorts of devices have things like built-in memory and things, but that's not exclusive to digital devices. They just typically have things like that. Older styled analog devices have an actual dial that moves. The benefit to the dial, as you can see, I put a Geiger counter on this unit, as you can see very quickly, oh, I have it set to slow mode. You can see it very quickly responding. Do you see what I mean? If we change the multiplication factor, it's much easier to find a radioactive item when you're hunting when you can quickly see this response. The response really flows with what it is you're looking at as opposed to having to wait. Now the downside is when you have a unit like this, you quickly can max it out, in which case you have to constantly keep playing with the multiplication factors, increasing it. What this means is what you're seeing on the screen is times 1, it's exactly what it looks like. Times 10, it's times 10. Times 100, times 1000. Some of them do auto scale, this one does not. If you want, however, to get some of the same functionality you get out of this guy with accuracy, you can switch to the slow motion setting. A lot of these type of detectors like this, a lot of them have this. It takes longer to get to the actual reading, but it's much more precise and doesn't move around as much. And you hit the reset button to go back down again. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for. I would use something like this if I were hunting for uranium out in the desert someplace, or if I were somebody at like a checkpoint, for example. If I were, let's say, law enforcement at a checkpoint, I were looking for checking somebody's car to make sure they weren't bringing something terrible with them. I would have something like this, where I could go past something and quickly see whether it puts off a reading. If I were in a disaster situation, where I'm just looking to know, like, what's my background? Is it safe here to be in this area? I'd want something more like this. If I were just doing, just looking at small samples in a school science lab, I'd want something like this digital guy right here. So there's a strength and a weakness to both of these two units. I cannot actually say that one is better than the other. I prefer this one. That is a completely preferential thing. That is not because this is better than this. I ironically own more of this type. So there you go. Alright, so let's get into units. This is the unit of information displayed to you. It's kind of like the explanation of how much radiation you're being exposed to. The Geiger counters are never going to be exact. They're never going to tell you exactly what you're being exposed to. That takes a lot of science. It takes somebody like a health physicist and all this math. So whatever you see on the screen is, think of it sort of like an approximation. It's not going to be exact, right? And so basically you end up with two types of units and two types of detectors. The first type of unit is the simple basic count per minute or per second. I mean, I guess you could be counts per hour, but I've never seen such a thing. So counts per minute, counts per second. These display on the reading right here. This guy's in counts per minute, for example. When you put it near something radioactive, let's see, where's our little radioactive source? Here we go, cesium-137. So we put it near this, and you see it starts to rise up. See it rising up? And it says that I'm getting 100 counts per minute, 200 counts per minute, and speed it up a little bit there, 400, 500, it's almost off the scale. So the point is counts per minute is a very, very good unit to use because it doesn't convey any information to you other than the most important thing. The only thing a Geiger counter is even able to detect, which is that I'm detecting a particle that flew through me. Oh, look, I'm detecting another particle. That's the only thing a Geiger counter can detect. It can't tell you the energy of the particle that hit you, what it came from, anything about it. And so the only real thing it's able to tell you is that it happened, it happened, it happened, it happened. That's why counts per minute's good, because it's not giving you any information beyond that. So it's not inferring anything that's not true. It's telling you exactly what it does know. I detected something radioactive. Every tick that you hear, every beep that you hear is something radioactive. So it's being honest. Now, you have other units, for example, microsieverts per hour. If you let you see that unit right there. There's microsieverts per hour, milliroentgens per hour, millirims per hour, grays, micro-R, all these sorts of things. All these other types of readings that you see here are energy-based readings. They're designed to convey the biological effect, for example, of the radiation, or the absorbed dose. All these doses that involve how much radiation is being absorbed into matter, and potentially, depending on the unit, how much of an effect that has on matter. The downside to that, though, is that for all of those units to work, you have to know one important thing. You have to know how much energy is being put out. And two, radioactive materials, for example, cobalt-60 and cesium-137, put out entirely different energies. Entirely different. So they will read incorrectly in the unit unless the unit is absolutely calibrated for them. This machine's calibrated for cesium-137, so in a laboratory condition I can use cesium-137 and get an accurate reading. But that's only in a laboratory condition. When you're out in the field somewhere, you're going to be getting false readings otherwise. Now, they are oftentimes, some of these detectors, not this guy, but some of these types of detectors have been specially designed to deal with this exact problem. Sometimes they have a little devices put over the front of them. That's not what this is, but they look similar to this. I'm just going to kind of put this over. And they're energy compensated. And what they do is they have a material in front of them that kind of changes the sensitivity based on energy to make two completely different radionuclides that have two completely different energies read approximately the same. They kind of flatten that whole sensitivity with respect to energy curve. They kind of flatten that out a little bit. So if you get a unit and you want to use it for energy units like microsieverts and stuff like that, if you really want to do that, make sure, if you're going to get a Geiger counter and you're just obsessed with doing that, make sure you get one that's energy compensated. Alright, or buy an energy compensation filter. You can buy them like Ludlam has them. You can stick them right over the top of this pancake detector and it becomes energy compensated. It's still not going to give you an accurate, a very accurate result, but it will give you a reasonably accurate result. It's not going to be like off in Timbuktu. It's going to be close. If you're really looking for actual really good accuracy with energy, you want something like a scintillation counter like this guy right here that actually has it's an energy sensitive scintillation counter, and it actually tells you the real reading. Given a few seconds, this thing's going to slow down to about 6 microsieverts per hour, which is about what you should be getting off of half of this guy right here, which is about 12 microsieverts per hour. So you want something like this, but this isn't a Geiger counter. It's also a lot more expensive. So let me put that out of the way. Most Geiger counters can switch between these. Like this guy right here can switch between them. This one right here, you can remove the faceplate, stick on another one that has the different reading type on it, but you have to recalibrate it. But you know, it can be switched. But if you're getting one, make sure you're not getting a Geiger counter that only reads in energy units. You'll see them on the websites. They always show the energy unit, microsieverts per hour, especially if they're Japanese ones. They love to show that. Make sure they can switch to like counts per second or counts per minute. I recommend counts per minute. Make sure, because if they don't, you're going to be stuck with this energy unit thing, which isn't accurate per se. It's accurate enough to, like, you know, tell you that you're in or not inside of a really, you know, dangerous area, but it's not perfect. All right. Now, finally, what to avoid. Be darn careful when you're buying a Geiger counter to avoid detectors that are not actually Geiger counters. You'll find CDV 717, 715. These are ionization detectors. They're useless to you unless you're like standing right beside Chernobyl. Okay. CDV 700, not bad. CDV 717, bad. Not bad, but bad for most people. Electromagnetic field detectors. Oh God, you'll see them all the time. They'll say electromagnetic radiation detector. Not a Geiger counter. Look to make sure it's an actual Geiger counter. It should actually be a Geiger counter. It should say in the paperwork that it detects gamma radiation. If nothing more, it must at least detect gamma radiation. No matter how thick the housing is, if it doesn't detect gamma radiation, it's useless. That's kind of the easiest way to determine which one is which. So never ever pick the wrong type of detector. Watch out for old units. For example, this Model 12, it's kind of expensive. If you buy a Model 3 detector that's like this, and it has a 44-9 detector in the back that looks like this, for example, so it looks, if you see it on the YouTube, on the eBay things, it'll look like this. right? It looked like that basically. You'll see lots of them. You'll also see lots of these old guys right here, the CDV 700s. Be careful. Some of them are in wonderful working condition. They have scratches all over them. It's kind of normal to find them that way, but that doesn't mean that they're not working right. But look into the seller, ask questions, ask about warranty, read the warranty carefully. Sometimes they'll warranty everything but the tube. Why? Because the tube's about to blow. Some of these older units, this is actually a new unit, some of these older units right here require a lot of repair. Now if you can repair a standard analog television, you can follow the circuit diagram and repair this, but you need to know how to do that because this guy has refurbished parts and it's been completely calibrated and rebuilt and everything like that. But if you buy an older one, you might need to do some repairs on it. And that means opening this thing up and going at it with a soldering iron and like a screwdriver. And there are high voltage components in this. So keep that in mind. When they say, oh, when you see them on the internet, sometimes they'll say like this one did, I paid more for this because it was refurbished, brand new parts put into it, everything circuit tested all the way with a warranty and everything. It cost more, but it's also more likely to hold up. If you just get a random one for 25, 30, 40 bucks, it may run for years. It may break before it even gets to your house. If you get something like this from Ludlam, it's a modern day unit. It isn't going to be breaking the second you get it home because it's brand new, and if it does, it has a warranty. But if you get one of these that's used, make sure it has a warranty, or make sure that it has some sort of certification about how it's been repaired and taken care of, or that's calibrated, or at least that you can send it back. Now, with the modern day units, you can also ship them back to Ludlam to have them repaired, but if you buy it and have to get it repaired immediately, then you don't really save very much on not buying just a new unit to begin with, if that makes any sense right there. And the last thing to bring up is food testing. One of the #1 things I get asked about, food testing. So let me just give you a special little bit on food testing. All contamination is discontamination from scientifically speaking, but I break it into 2 categories. These are my 2 categories that I break them into, okay? I'm just making sure you understand the difference between science and Tom. Okay, I like to break them into gross contamination and trace contamination. What's the difference? Gross contamination is something that's just ridiculously contaminated. So let's say we go to a small little grocery store mini mart that's right outside of the Fukushima plant. So we go to a family mart or something right outside of the Fukushima. The place is abandoned. There are dogs digging around inside of it. It's like been abandoned for since Fukushima happened, that kind of a place. Okay, or downtown Chernobyl, and you find an old military rations or something. When you pick one of those up and you put a detector over top of it, it's going to be reading thousands of counts per minute. That's not trace contamination. That's gross contamination. It's just radiating radiation. Okay, a Geiger counter can detect that. So if you were if you had a nuclear event and you had like a box of food in your house and you could test it with that to know whether or not it was obviously radioactive. Now you might say, Tom, what's that going to do about the trace radiation, which is still very dangerous? Well, you're not going to be able to detect that worth anything with a Geiger counter. But if you're in an emergency situation and there's nothing else you can do and no other clean source of food, they're very useful in that. At least you know you're not eating something that's going to melt your skin off, right? You're still probably ingesting some bad stuff, but it's better than nothing. It's kind of like taking water and putting those little pills in it that neutralize the bad stuff. I'm sure that's not really healthy to drink lots of that kind of stuff, you know, the neutralized water stuff, but it's better than dying of lack of thirst. So that's gross contamination. Trace contamination is something like maybe, perhaps there's a microscopic amount of cesium-137 in this food, maybe there's not. I'm not saying there is, but maybe there is. And it could be or maybe not be over the FDA limits. Maybe it's right on the FDA limits. These are trace amounts. We're talking like 200-300 becquerels per kilogram, very small amounts. Devices like a Geiger counter, only under the most absolutely hardcore laboratory conditions can you even detect that that exists. And when you do detect that it exists, you still don't know if it's just natural potassium, natural material that's in this, or if it's the cesium-137. You need something called a gamma spectrometer. They're expensive, they're complicated to use. I have many videos on them. So a lot of people ask me, can I use this for food testing? The answer is not really. It's a squirrely answer. Yes, you can, technically speaking, but my God, it's difficult. It's ridiculously difficult. You have to put this beside the unit. You have to test it for a long period of time in a controlled setting, with and without stuff, multiple tests, compare the difference between them, standard deviations from the norm, statistical stuff. all of these things, and even then you still don't actually know what you've detected. You just know that there's something there, which could just be natural potassium for all you know. So yes, they can be used for food testing, but not really, well, because people aren't just asking, can it be done? What they really want to know is, can I be safe with this? Can I test my food at home and be safe with it? That's what they're asking. The answer to that is no. Can it be done? Sure. Can it be done the way people are actually asking the question? No. Not with this kind of unit. In fact, not even with my Ludlum. This isn't even good enough to do it. That spectrometer I showed you a few minutes ago, that can do it. But you need something like that. I'll put links for food testers in here if you want to see them. In the bottom I'll put a couple links for them. But honestly, food testers are not cheap. You could get a dozen of these things probably for the cost of a food tester. And that's just the way that is. I'm sorry I didn't make the rules, that's how it is. So if you have any questions, drop them off in the video. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Hopefully this has helped you. The biggest question I get asked, of course, is always, how can I get a Geiger counter? I only have $100 or whatever to get it. I put a list of a couple decent examples in the actual details based on dollar values. Nobody paid me to put them there. Nobody contacted me and said, hey buddy, could you list me that? Nobody did that. I went out and found them myself. If you know better examples of them than that, please send them to me, and I will look at them and see whether or not I want to put them on there as well. All right. Yeah. So I haven't been paid to do anything. None of these items were for free or anything. I've been given a couple of free devices before, and I didn't show any of those in this video. That's one of the reasons I don't have any of those in this video. I have lots of other detectors because I don't want to go into any of that. I don't want anybody to have owned me or something like that. So I just, all of these guys here with my hard-earned cash. All right. So this has been Tom from anti-proton.com, and hopefully this has been of some use.